Have you ever felt your heart pounding so hard in your chest that you thought everyone around you could hear it? Have you ever stood in a room full of people who thought they knew you, only to realize they didn't know you at all? Well, let me tell you about the day I walked into that conference room and dropped a truth bomb that shattered everything my coworkers believed about me, about themselves, and about the company we all worked for. That moment, that precise second when I revealed I was actually their boss, not just another struggling employee like them. The silence that followed was so thick, so heavy, so suffocating, that I could literally feel it pressing against my skin like a physical force. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand why that moment was so devastating, so life-changing, so absolutely necessary, I need to take you back to where it all began, to the day I made a decision that would alter the course of my life and the lives of everyone around me forever. My name is Sarah, and I'm the CEO of a mid-sized marketing firm called Velocity Brands. Though for 3 months, nobody in my own company knew that. You see, I inherited this company from my father, a brilliant businessman who built everything from the ground up, who poured his heart and soul into creating something meaningful, something that mattered. When he passed away suddenly from a heart attack at just 62 years old, I was thrust into a position I never thought I'd occupy. Not so soon anyway. Not like this. Not through such heartbreaking circumstances. I was 31 years old, grieving the loss of my best friend and mentor, and suddenly responsible for 230 employees, their families, their livelihoods, their dreams. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, absolutely crushing. My father had always told me that leadership isn't about sitting in a corner office making decisions from afar. It's about understanding the people you're leading, really understanding them, seeing the world through their eyes, feeling their struggles, their fears, their aspirations. He used to say that the moment you lose touch with the heartbeat of your organization is the moment that organization starts to die. Those words haunted me during those first few weeks after his funeral, when I was trying to figure out how to fill shoes that felt impossibly large, how to honor his legacy while also making the company my own. I started reviewing reports, conducting meetings with department heads, analyzing our financial statements, all the things a new CEO is supposed to do, all the proper procedures, all the expected actions. But something felt wrong, deeply wrong, fundamentally wrong. The numbers looked good on paper, profits were steady, client retention was acceptable, employee turnover was within industry standards, everything seemed fine, perfectly fine, almost too fine. But I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut, this nagging sensation that I was missing something crucial, something important, something that those polished reports and carefully prepared presentations weren't showing me. The department heads all smiled and nodded during meetings, assuring me that everything was running smoothly, that the team was strong, that morale was high, that we were positioned for continued success. Their words were confident, their presentations were slick, their demeanor was professional, but something in their eyes told a different story, something hollow, something guarded, something that made my instincts scream that I wasn't getting the whole truth. I remember sitting in my father's old office late one evening. It was around 9 p.m., and the building was mostly empty except for a few dedicated souls still burning the midnight oil, and I found myself staring at a photograph on the wall. It was a picture from 15 years ago showing my father wearing a company t-shirt and jeans, his arm around a warehouse worker, both of them laughing at some joke I'd never know. Both of them looking genuinely happy, genuinely connected, genuinely real. That's when it hit me, the idea that would change everything. The decision that would lead to that devastating moment of silence I mentioned at the beginning, the choice that would force me to confront truths I wasn't sure I was ready to face. What if I went undercover? What if I experienced the company not as the CEO, not as the boss's daughter, not as someone everyone was trying to impress or hide things from, but as just another employee, just another person trying to make a living, just another worker dealing with whatever reality existed beneath the surface of those glossy reports? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Perfect sense. Necessary sense. I could see the real culture, hear the real conversations, feel the real energy, or lack thereof, that pulsed through the company my father had built and loved so deeply. I knew it was risky, incredibly risky, potentially explosive. If people found out, if they felt betrayed, if they accused me of being manipulative or deceitful, it could damage trust irreparably. It could destroy the very thing I was trying to save. But I also knew that I couldn't lead effectively if I was blind to reality, if I was making decisions based on filtered information, if I was living in a bubble while my employees suffered or struggled or dealt with problems I couldn't even imagine, because nobody was willing to tell the CEO the truth. So I made the decision. And once I made it, there was no turning back, no second guessing, no room for doubt. I worked with my father's most trusted advisor, Marcus, a man who had been with the company for 25 years and who understood my vision immediately, because he had watched my father do similar things in the early days, though never quite to this extent. Together we crafted a plan, a cover story, a new identity that would allow me to slip into the organization unnoticed. I would be Sarah Mitchell, not Sarah Morrison, using my mother's maiden name to avoid any immediate connections. I would be a new hire in the marketing department, starting at an entry-level position, coming in with a decent resume but nothing spectacular, nothing that would draw too much attention, nothing that would make me stand out in any significant way. Marcus would handle all the official paperwork, make sure I was in the system properly, ensure that my real identity remained hidden in locked files that only he could access. We decided I would do this for 3 months, long enough to really integrate myself into the company culture, short enough that I could still maintain the ruse without it becoming impossible to manage. I went shopping for a completely new wardrobe, nothing designer, nothing expensive, nothing that would hint at my actual financial situation. I bought clothes from Target and H&M, practical shoes that were comfortable but unremarkable, a backpack instead of my usual leather bag, even cheap drugstore makeup instead of the luxury brands I was accustomed to. I changed my hair, cutting it shorter and dyeing it a slightly darker shade, not enough to be dramatic, but enough to alter my appearance just a bit. I practiced my backstory until it felt natural, until I could recite details about my fictional previous jobs and my fictional apartment and my fictional struggles without hesitation, without that telltale pause that signals deception. My heart was racing the morning I walked through those front doors as Sarah Mitchell for the first time. My stomach was doing flips and turns. My hands were slightly sweaty despite the cool air conditioning. My mind was spinning with 1,000 what-ifs and possibilities and potential disasters. But I kept my face neutral, kept my breathing steady, kept my shoulders relaxed, and stepped into a world that was both intimately familiar and completely foreign at the same time. The onboarding process was eye-opening in ways I never expected, in ways that made me uncomfortable, in ways that planted the first seeds of what would eventually become that devastating revelation. I sat in a sterile conference room with 5 other new hires, all of us clutching our folders and trying to look enthusiastic, while HR representative Jennifer Chen went through presentation after presentation about company policies, benefits packages, workplace conduct expectations, and organizational structure. Jennifer was efficient, professional, almost robotic in her delivery, as if she had given this exact speech 1,000 times before and would give it 1,000 times more, each iteration slightly more soulless than the last. There was no warmth, no genuine welcome, no sense that anyone actually cared whether we succeeded or failed, whether we stayed or left, whether we became part of the family or just another statistic in the turnover reports. The other new hires seemed to notice it too. I could see it in their faces, that slight disappointment, that fading excitement, that realization that maybe this job wasn't going to be quite as wonderful as the recruitment materials had suggested. During lunch break on that first day, I found myself sitting alone in the cafeteria, which was really just a room with some vending machines, a few microwaves, and uncomfortable plastic chairs that looked like they hadn't been replaced since the 90s. Definitely not since my father had last renovated the space. I was picking at a sad sandwich I'd brought from home when a woman about my age, maybe a year or two younger, plopped down across from me with a heavy sigh that spoke volumes about her own emotional state. Her name was Jessica, and she worked in the social media department, and she had the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been working here long enough to have lost whatever optimism she might have started with. We started talking, just casual conversation at first, the usual new job small talk about where we were from, and what brought us to Velocity Brands and what our first impressions were so far. But then Jessica leaned in closer, lowered her voice to just above a whisper, and said something that made my blood run cold, made my stomach drop, made me realize that my instincts about something being wrong had been absolutely correct. She said that I seemed nice, seemed genuine, seemed like maybe I actually cared about doing good work, and that she wanted to warn me before I got too invested, before I made the mistake of thinking this place was anything other than what it really was. She told me that the culture here had changed dramatically over the past few years, that it used to be better, used to feel more like a family, used to be the kind of place where people actually wanted to come to work every day. But now, she said with genuine sadness in her voice, now it was all about politics and favoritism and covering your ass and making sure you never made anyone above you look bad, even if it meant compromising your integrity, your values, your sense of right and wrong. I wanted to defend my company, wanted to insist she must be exaggerating, wanted to believe that the organization my father had built with such love and intention couldn't have deteriorated so badly in the relatively short time since his death. But something in her eyes, something raw and honest and painful, told me she was speaking the truth, her truth at least. And if even one employee felt this way, I needed to take it seriously, needed to investigate further, needed to understand what had happened and why and how to fix it. Over the following days and weeks, I started to see what Jessica meant, started to witness the dysfunction firsthand, started to experience the toxic undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of seemingly normal workplace interactions. My direct supervisor, a man named Derek who was the marketing manager, was one of those people who smiled to your face while simultaneously undermining you behind your back, who took credit for other people's ideas while deflecting blame for his own mistakes, who ruled through fear and intimidation disguised as high standards and accountability. I watched him berate a junior designer named Tommy for a minor error in a presentation, literally raising his voice in the middle of the open office space, humiliating this young man in front of everyone, crushing his spirit over what amounted to a typo that could have been fixed in 30 seconds. The worst part wasn't Derek's behavior, though that was bad enough. It was the reaction of everyone else. People just put their heads down, avoided eye contact, pretended not to hear the verbal assault happening just feet away from them, as if by ignoring it they could somehow make themselves invisible, somehow protect themselves from becoming the next target. Nobody said anything, nobody intervened, nobody stood up for Tommy, and I felt this rage building inside me, this fury at what my company had become, at what was happening in my father's name, in the organization he had poured his life into creating. But I couldn't say anything. Not yet, because Sarah Mitchell was just a new entry-level employee who needed this job, who couldn't afford to make waves, who had to keep her head down and play the game just like everyone else. After Derek's tirade ended and he stormed back to his office, slamming the door hard enough to make the walls shake, I walked over to Tommy's desk where he sat with his face red and his eyes suspiciously moist, clearly fighting back tears, clearly trying to maintain some shred of dignity in the aftermath of his public humiliation. I put my hand gently on his shoulder and told him that I thought his work was actually really good, that the presentation was strong overall, that one tiny mistake didn't negate all the effort he'd put into it. He looked up at me with such gratitude, such relief, such desperate need for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that what had just happened wasn't okay, wasn't normal, wasn't acceptable. He thanked me quietly and then told me something that broke my heart into a million pieces. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my own company. He said that this happened all the time, that Derek treated people this way constantly, that several talented employees had already quit because they couldn't take it anymore, that HR knew about it but never did anything because Derek's department consistently hit their numbers, and apparently results were all that mattered. Apparently treating people with basic human decency was optional, as long as the profit margins looked good. Have you ever felt completely powerless in a situation where you actually held all the power but couldn't use it without revealing yourself? That's how I felt in that moment, and it was absolutely agonizing, completely frustrating, fundamentally wrong. I went home that night to my small apartment, not my actual house, but the modest place I'd rented specifically for this undercover operation, and I cried for the first time since my father's funeral. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my soul, somewhere that recognized I had failed him, failed his vision, failed to protect the people he had cared about so deeply. The pattern continued and actually intensified as I became more embedded in the daily operations, as people started to trust me enough to share their real feelings, their actual experiences, their genuine frustrations with how things worked at Velocity Brands. I learned that favoritism was rampant, that promotions went to people who knew how to play office politics rather than people who actually deserved them based on merit or skill or contribution. I discovered that the anonymous suggestion box that was supposed to give employees a voice was widely regarded as a joke, that suggestions disappeared into a black hole never to be seen again, that the few times someone had made a serious complaint about workplace issues, they had somehow ended up being the ones pushed out of the company, while the problems they reported continued unchanged. I found out that several departments had cliques that excluded certain people based on arbitrary factors like where they went to college or whether they were invited to happy hours or whether they fit some undefined cultural mold that seemed to shift depending on who was doing the defining. I witnessed microaggressions, subtle forms of discrimination that were hard to pin down or prove, but created an environment where some people felt consistently othered, consistently less than, consistently like they had to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. There was this brilliant woman named Keisha in the analytics department who had a PhD in data science from MIT, who had published papers in peer-reviewed journals, who was objectively one of the smartest people in the entire building. But I watched as her ideas were constantly dismissed or attributed to others, as her contributions were minimized, as she was passed over for a promotion that went to a less qualified man who happened to golf with the VP every weekend. The injustice of it made me physically ill, made me lose sleep at night, made me lie in my rented bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how my father's dream had twisted into this nightmare, how an organization built on principles of respect and excellence and opportunity had devolved into a place where talent was wasted and people were diminished, and the only thing that seemed to matter was maintaining the status quo. I started keeping detailed notes, documenting everything I witnessed, recording conversations when legally permissible, building a case that I knew I would need when the time came to reveal myself and enact real change. But the more evidence I gathered, the more complicated my feelings became, the more I struggled with my own role in this dysfunction, my own complicity even as an unwitting participant. Because here's the thing that nobody talks about when they discuss corporate leadership and organizational culture and all those business school concepts that sound so clean and simple in theory. I had been the CEO for months before going undercover, and during that time I had sat in my office reviewing reports that showed everything was fine, listening to executives assure me that morale was good, believing that the systems my father had put in place were still functioning as intended. But they weren't. They really weren't, and I had been blind to it, willfully or otherwise. And that meant I bore some responsibility for allowing it to continue, for not digging deeper sooner, for not being the leader these people needed and deserved. The worst part about being undercover wasn't witnessing the toxic behavior or experiencing the daily indignities that my employees endured, though those things were certainly painful and infuriating and motivating in their own right. The worst part was forming genuine connections with people while knowing I was lying to them every single day, while knowing that eventually I would have to reveal a truth that would make them question everything we had shared together, every moment of trust and vulnerability and friendship. Jessica became my closest friend at work, my lunch buddy, my confidant in those quiet moments when we could escape the office for a walk or a coffee break, or just a few minutes of honest conversation away from watchful eyes and listening ears. She told me about her dreams of eventually starting her own boutique marketing agency, about how she felt stuck at Velocity Brands but couldn't leave because she had student loans and a sick mother and bills that just kept piling up no matter how hard she worked or how many extra hours she put in. She shared her fears that she was wasting her best years in a place that didn't value her, that she was becoming cynical and bitter and tired in ways that scared her, that she was losing touch with the passionate, creative person she used to be. And I listened and empathized and offered what support I could, all while knowing that I could actually help her in ways she couldn't imagine, that I had the power to change her circumstances with a single conversation, a single decision, a single revelation of my true identity. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because the bigger picture required me to maintain the deception, to keep gathering information, to truly understand the scope of the problems before attempting solutions. There were others too, like Marcus, a different Marcus, not my father's advisor, a middle-aged man in accounting who worked tirelessly despite chronic back pain because he needed the health insurance to cover his wife's cancer treatments, who never complained even though I could see the exhaustion etched deep in the lines of his face, who showed up every day with a smile and a kind word for everyone, even though his own world was crumbling. Or Samantha, a young woman fresh out of college who reminded me so much of myself at that age, full of enthusiasm and ideas and hope that slowly, painfully, visibly diminished with each passing week as she realized that her contributions weren't valued, that her voice didn't matter, that she was expected to just shut up and do what she was told regardless of whether it made sense or served the client's best interests. I wanted to scoop all these people up, protect them, fix everything immediately, wave a magic wand and make the company what it should have been all along. But real change doesn't work that way. Sustainable transformation requires understanding root causes and building buy-in and creating systems that work not because someone at the top demands it, but because everyone throughout the organization believes in it and commits to it. So I kept playing my role, kept being Sarah Mitchell, the entry-level employee, kept my secrets locked away even as they grew heavier and heavier with each passing day. Then came the incident that changed everything, the moment that made me realize I couldn't wait any longer, that the 3-month timeline I had set for myself was too long, that people were being hurt in real time, and my information gathering had to take a back seat to protecting the individuals who depended on this company for their livelihoods and their dignity. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, one of those gray, depressing days when the weather matched the mood inside the office, when everyone seemed to be going through the motions without any real energy or enthusiasm or joy. There was a big presentation scheduled for a potential client, a major account that could bring in millions of dollars and significantly impact our yearly revenue, and Derek had assigned the project to a small team that included me, Jessica, Tommy, and 2 others. We had worked on it for weeks, staying late countless nights, sacrificing weekends, pouring our creativity and expertise and passion into creating something we genuinely believed was excellent, something that showcased what Velocity Brands could be at its best. The presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m., and we were all nervous but excited, ready to show what we had accomplished together, ready to hopefully land this account and prove that our hard work mattered. But at 1 p.m., just an hour before the client was supposed to arrive, Derek called us all into his office with a serious expression that immediately made my stomach drop, that triggered every alarm bell in my nervous system. He sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable and annoyed, and he told us in a flat, emotionless voice that the presentation was off, that he had reviewed our work and decided it wasn't up to his standards, that he couldn't risk putting something subpar in front of such an important potential client. We were stunned, absolutely stunned, completely blindsided. Jessica found her voice first and asked what specifically was wrong with the presentation, what needed to be changed, what we could fix in the next hour to make it acceptable. Derek waved his hand dismissively and said it wasn't any one thing. It was the overall approach, the strategic direction, the execution, basically everything, and that there wasn't time to fix it. So he had decided to present his own pitch instead, one that he had been working on separately, one that none of us had ever seen or contributed to. The implications were clear, brutally clear, devastatingly clear. He was taking the credit opportunity for himself, cutting us out completely, ensuring that if the client signed, it would be his win and his alone, and if they didn't, he could blame our supposedly inadequate initial work for putting him in a difficult position. Tommy's face went white. Jessica's eyes filled with tears she tried desperately to hide, and I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced before, a fury so intense that I literally had to clench my fists under the table to keep from saying something that would blow my cover right then and there. This wasn't just bad management. This was cruelty. This was abuse of power. This was exactly the kind of behavior that destroyed morale and drove good people away and corrupted organizational culture from the inside out. And in that moment, watching my employees, my people, the individuals whose well-being I was responsible for, being treated with such callous disregard, I made a decision that I couldn't unmake, that I wouldn't unmake even knowing all the complications it would create. I spent that night making calls, coordinating with Marcus, my advisor, preparing for what needed to happen next, planning the revelation that would either save the company or destroy whatever fragile trust remained. I barely slept, my mind racing through scenarios and possibilities and potential reactions, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I was about to hurt people I cared about, people who had welcomed Sarah Mitchell as a friend and colleague, without knowing she was actually Sarah Morrison, their CEO. The next morning, Friday, I arrived at the office early and sent an email from my real account requesting an all-hands meeting for that afternoon. Mandatory attendance for every employee who wasn't actively with a client. No exceptions. I watched the confusion ripple through the office as people received the notice, speculation running wild about what the CEO could possibly want, whether there were layoffs coming or a merger or some other dramatic announcement that required gathering everyone together. Derek preened around the office acting like he had insider information, dropping hints that perhaps his successful presentation yesterday, the client had apparently responded positively to his pitch, had caught executive attention, that maybe he was being considered for a promotion, that everyone should probably be prepared for some organizational changes that would elevate people who actually delivered results. I wanted to laugh at his arrogance, wanted to rage at his continued cruelty, as he made pointed comments about how some people talked a big game but couldn't perform when it mattered, clearly referring to our team and our supposedly inadequate work. Jessica kept giving me these searching looks throughout the morning, as if she sensed something was different about me, as if she could feel the tension radiating off me in waves despite my efforts to appear normal and calm, and just like regular Sarah Mitchell who minded her own business and didn't make trouble. At 2 p.m., people started filing into the largest conference room we had, the one usually reserved for major client presentations and quarterly reviews, the one that could hold about 100 people comfortably, though it would be standing room only today. The energy was anxious, uncertain, filled with that particular dread that comes from not knowing what's about to happen, but sensing it's probably not good. I positioned myself near the back, watching faces, reading body language, seeing the fear and resignation that so many people carried as their default state in this building. At 2:15, the door opened and in walked the executive team, the VPs and directors who reported directly to me, and I saw their faces scanning the crowd with barely concealed contempt, saw the way they held themselves above everyone else, saw the disconnect between leadership and workforce that had grown so wide it had become an unbridgeable chasm. And then finally I walked in behind them, not through the employee entrance at the back, but through the executive entrance at the front, dressed not in my usual Target clothes, but in a designer suit that probably cost more than most people in that room made in a month. My hair styled professionally, my demeanor completely different from the timid entry-level employee they had known as Sarah Mitchell. The room fell silent, utterly silent. So silent I could hear the air conditioning system humming in the background. So silent I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. So silent that I knew this moment would be seared into everyone's memory forever. I took my place at the front of the room, standing behind the podium where the CEO was supposed to stand, where I belonged but had been avoiding for months, where I now needed to be in order to do what had to be done. I looked out at the sea of confused faces, saw Jessica's mouth literally hanging open in shock, saw Tommy looking like he might faint, saw Derek's expression morphing from confusion to recognition to horror as he began to understand what was happening. I took a deep breath, gripped the edges of the podium to steady myself, and began to speak in a voice that was clear and firm and couldn't be mistaken for anyone other than the person in charge, the person with ultimate authority, the person they had known as Sarah Mitchell but who was about to reveal herself as Sarah Morrison. I told them who I really was, that I was the CEO, that I had inherited the company from my father, that I had been working among them for the past 3 months not as an entry-level employee but undercover, experiencing the reality of Velocity brands from the inside out, seeing and feeling and understanding what they dealt with every single day. The silence that followed my revelation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, but rather the complete absence of sound, as if the entire room had collectively stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing for just a moment while their brains tried to process what they had just heard, tried to reconcile Sarah Mitchell, their colleague, with Sarah Morrison, their CEO, tried to understand what this meant and why I had done it and what was going to happen next. I saw betrayal in Jessica's eyes, confusion in Tommy's face, fear in Marcus from accounting's expression, anger starting to form in several others as they realized they had been deceived, that someone they had trusted had been lying to them the entire time, that their vulnerabilities and confidences and honest moments had been shared with someone who wasn't who they claimed to be. I wanted to stop right there, wanted to apologize, wanted to explain away their hurt and make it okay, but I knew that I couldn't, that I had to push through this moment, that I had to make them understand why I had done this terrible, necessary thing. I continued speaking, my voice steady, even though my insides were churning with emotion, even though I could feel tears threatening at the backs of my eyes, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run away from the pain I was causing. I told them that I had done this because I needed to know the truth, that the reports I was receiving were painting a picture that didn't feel right, that my father had taught me that leadership meant truly understanding your people, not just managing them from afar. I acknowledged that my deception had hurt them, that I had violated their trust, that I understood if they were angry, or felt betrayed, or wanted to hate me for what I had done. But I also told them what I had discovered during my 3 months undercover, and as I spoke, I saw some faces start to shift, saw understanding beginning to dawn, saw people recognizing that maybe this woman at the front of the room actually did understand their struggles because she had lived them, had experienced them, had felt the weight of them pressing down day after day. I talked about Derek's abusive behavior, and I watched him shrink in his seat as every eye in the room turned to look at him with varying degrees of anger and vindication. I discussed the favoritism and the broken systems and the ways that talent was being wasted and voices were being silenced. I mentioned specific people, like Keisha, whose brilliance was being overlooked, like Tommy, who had been humiliated for minor mistakes, like Marcus, who came to work every day carrying burdens no one should have to bear alone, like Samantha, whose enthusiasm was being systematically crushed. I told them about the presentation that Derek had stolen, about credit not being given where it was due, about a culture that had become toxic and needed to change fundamentally and completely. And then I did something that I don't think most CEOs would do, something that made me incredibly vulnerable but felt absolutely necessary in that moment. I apologized sincerely and deeply and without reservation. I apologized for not seeing these problems sooner, for not being accessible enough that people felt they could come to me directly, for allowing systems to exist that protected bad behavior and punished good faith efforts. I apologized specifically to the people who had befriended Sarah Mitchell, who had shared their hearts with someone they thought was just like them, who now felt foolish or used or betrayed. I told them that every friendship, every conversation, every moment of connection had been real for me, that I genuinely cared about them as people, not just as employees, that my deception about my identity didn't negate the authenticity of my feelings or my commitment to making things better. Then came the hardest part, the part where I had to turn words into actions, where I had to prove that this hadn't just been some voyeuristic exercise in slumming with the common folk, but rather a genuine attempt to understand and improve. I announced that effective immediately, Derek was being terminated for cause, and I watched as he sputtered and tried to protest, claiming that I couldn't do this, that his numbers were good, that he delivered results, that personalities and management styles shouldn't matter if the work got done. I cut him off and told him in no uncertain terms that how we treat people matters more than quarterly metrics, that a toxic manager who hits targets isn't worth the talent they drive away and the damage they do to culture, that he had 30 minutes to collect his personal belongings, and that security would escort him from the building. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs, people barely able to believe what they were witnessing, barely able to process that someone was finally being held accountable for behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. I continued with more announcements, each one designed to show that I meant business, that this wasn't empty rhetoric or temporary enthusiasm that would fade once the meeting ended. I announced that I was promoting Keisha to a newly created position of Director of Analytics with full authority to build her team and implement the data-driven strategies she had been proposing for years. I announced that Tommy would be leading the client presentation we would be rescheduling, that his work and that of his team deserved to be showcased, that their voices mattered. I announced that we were completely overhauling our HR systems, bringing in an outside consultant to conduct a comprehensive culture audit, implementing anonymous reporting systems that would actually be monitored and acted upon, creating clear paths for promotion based on merit rather than politics. I announced that I would be instituting regular town halls where any employee could ask me anything directly, that my office door would have open hours every week, that I wanted to build bridges, not walls, between leadership and the workforce. I announced raises for people who had been systematically underpaid, performance bonuses for teams whose work had gone unrecognized, additional support for employees dealing with health issues or family crises. With each announcement, I saw the energy in the room shift, saw skepticism giving way to cautious hope, saw people beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could actually be different, could actually be better, could actually become what my father had envisioned when he built this company decades ago. But I also saw lingering hurt in some faces, particularly Jessica's, and I knew that rebuilding trust would take more than grand gestures and policy changes, would require sustained effort and consistent follow-through and patience as people worked through their feelings about my deception. When I finished speaking and opened the floor for questions, the silence continued for several long, uncomfortable moments as people processed everything, as they tried to formulate words for the complex mix of emotions they were experiencing. Finally, Keisha stood up, and I braced myself for anger or accusation, but instead she asked a simple question that cut right to the heart of the matter. She asked if I was really committed to change, or if this was just a performance, a show of concern that would fade once the immediate crisis passed, once people stopped paying attention, once it became inconvenient to maintain these standards and these promises. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that I couldn't prove my commitment with words alone, that she and everyone else in that room had every right to be skeptical, that the only way I could demonstrate my sincerity was through consistent action over time, through following through on every promise I had made, through showing up every single day as a leader who actually cared about their well-being. I told her that I was prepared to be held accountable, that I wanted them to call me out if I failed to live up to these commitments, that I needed them to be partners in this transformation, not just passive recipients of whatever changes I decided to implement from on high. Other questions followed, some angry, some confused, some genuinely curious about specific details of various policies. I answered every single one honestly and directly, never deflecting or making excuses, always acknowledging when I didn't have an answer, but committing to find one and follow up. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours, far longer than I had planned, but it felt necessary to give everyone the space they needed to express themselves, to process what had happened, to begin the difficult work of rebuilding whatever came next. When people finally started to file out, some avoided my eyes while others nodded or even offered tentative smiles, and I felt the first tiny seed of hope that maybe I hadn't completely destroyed everything with my deception, that maybe the foundation for something better could be built from this rubble. Jessica was one of the last to leave, and she paused at the door, turning back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between hurt and understanding, between anger and respect, between betrayal and appreciation. She walked back toward me slowly, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, and asked if everything she had told me, all those vulnerable conversations about her dreams and fears and frustrations, had just been data collection for me, just information to be filed away and used for corporate purposes. I felt tears spring to my eyes as I told her absolutely not, that every moment we had shared had meant something to me, that I had come to genuinely care about her as a person, that nothing about our friendship had been fake even if the circumstances under which it formed were built on deception. I told her that I understood if she couldn't forgive me, if she needed time and space, if she never wanted to trust me again, but that I hoped eventually she might be able to see that I had done this terrible thing for what I believed were the right reasons, even if my methods were flawed and hurtful. She stood there for a long moment just looking at me, and then she said something that surprised me, something that gave me more hope than any policy change or organizational restructuring ever could. She said that she believed me, that she could see the pain in my eyes, that she knew I was genuinely struggling with what I had done, and that while she needed some time to work through her feelings, she was willing to try, willing to see if we could rebuild something authentic from the broken pieces of what we'd had before. She asked if Sarah Morrison, the CEO, was very different from Sarah Mitchell, the entry-level employee, and I smiled through my tears and told her that they were the same person, just with different responsibilities, that the woman who had eaten sad sandwiches with her in the cafeteria and complained about Derek's impossible standards and dreamed about a better workplace was still right here, still committed to the same values and goals, still her friend if she would allow it. Jessica nodded slowly, and then did something that absolutely broke me. She reached out and squeezed my hand briefly before turning and walking away, and in that simple gesture I felt both forgiveness and challenge, both acceptance and expectation, both grace and accountability. The days and weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, harder even than the grief of losing my father, because this was a different kind of loss, a different kind of pain that came from knowing I had caused harm, even while trying to do good, from watching people I cared about struggle with conflicting emotions about me and my choices. But they were also some of the most rewarding days because I got to see real change beginning to take root, got to watch the culture slowly shift, got to witness people starting to believe that their voices mattered, and their contributions were valued, and their well-being was important. Tommy's presentation to the client was a massive success, landing us the account and earning him a well-deserved promotion to senior designer. Keisha built an analytics team that transformed how we understood our market and our clients, implementing data-driven strategies that increased our efficiency by 30% in the first quarter alone. Marcus from accounting was connected with resources to help support his wife's treatment, and we adjusted his schedule to allow more flexibility without reducing his pay or benefits. Samantha found her voice again, pitching ideas in meetings that were actually heard and implemented, her enthusiasm returning bit by bit as she realized she could make a real difference. The culture audit revealed even more problems than I had discovered during my undercover time, but it also provided a roadmap for addressing them systematically and sustainably. We fired 3 more managers whose behavior was found to be inappropriate. We promoted people who had been overlooked for far too long. We restructured compensation to be more equitable. We created mentorship programs and professional development opportunities and channels for feedback that were actually monitored and acted upon. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't immediate. And there were setbacks and challenges and moments when I wondered if the damage I had done to trust would ever fully heal. But slowly, incrementally, day by day, the company began to transform into something closer to what my father had envisioned, into a place where people felt valued and heard and respected, into an organization that didn't just talk about caring for its employees, but actually demonstrated that care through consistent actions and policies. As I stand here now, 6 months after that devastating moment of silence when I revealed my true identity, I can tell you that it was worth it. Every uncomfortable moment, every hurt feeling, every difficult conversation, every challenge to my leadership and my methods. Because the alternative was allowing dysfunction to continue unchecked, allowing talented people to be diminished and demoralized, allowing my father's legacy to be corrupted by systems and behaviors that contradicted everything he stood for. I learned something profound during those 3 months undercover, and in the aftermath of my revelation, something that every leader should understand but too few actually do. You cannot lead people you don't truly know. You cannot create positive change without understanding the reality of what needs changing. You cannot demand trust and respect without earning it through genuine care and consistent action. The view from the corner office is comfortable but distorted, filtered through layers of hierarchy and politeness and people telling you what they think you want to hear rather than what you need to know. Sometimes the only way to see the truth is to experience it directly, to walk in your employees' shoes, to feel what they feel, to understand not just intellectually but viscerally what their daily reality entails. Now I want to hear from you, from everyone watching this video, because I know that many of you have experienced similar situations, whether as leaders trying to understand your organizations better, or as employees dealing with toxic workplace cultures, or as people struggling to navigate the complex dynamics of professional life. Have you ever worked in a place where you felt undervalued or unheard? Have you ever had a boss who didn't see you as a person but just as a number or a resource to be exploited? Have you ever wished that the people in charge could just understand what it's really like on the ground level, what it feels like to be dismissed or overlooked or treated with casual cruelty? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Tell me your stories. Let me know whether you think what I did was justified or wrong or something more complicated than either of those labels. I genuinely want to hear your perspectives because I believe that understanding comes from conversation, from sharing our truths with each other, from recognizing that we're all navigating these complicated human experiences together. If this story resonated with you, if it touched your heart or made you think about leadership or workplace culture or the ways we treat each other in professional settings, please leave a like on this video. Your likes help this content reach more people who might benefit from hearing about these experiences, who might be encouraged to speak up about their own workplace issues, who might be inspired to lead with more empathy and understanding. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more honest, vulnerable accounts of real human experiences and the lessons we can learn from them, please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic stories that matter, that make us think, that help us understand ourselves and each other better. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because I promise you there are more revelations to come, more truths that need to be told, more moments of transformation and growth and hard-won wisdom that I can't wait to share with you. Thank you for listening to my story, for being here with me in this moment, for being part of this community where we can be real with each other, where we can share our struggles and our triumphs without judgment, where we can learn from each other's experiences and grow together. Remember that change is possible, that speaking truth to power matters, that every voice has value, and that sometimes the silence that follows a revelation is just the pause before everything transforms into something better, something truer, something worth all the difficulty it took to get there. Until next time, keep sharing your truths, keep standing up for what's right, and keep believing that things can be better, because they absolutely can be if we're willing to do the hard work of making them so.